Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to Growers Daily, your daily dose of ecological farming insight. It is Wednesday, November the 20th, 2024, and today we are going to talk why more professional growers don't companion plant, southern accents, and should you do a farmer's market. So let's do it. All right, so I have been somewhat surprised over the last few days seeing how much people related to Monday's segment about bugs on windshields. Lots of people are sharing that same memory of bugs on cars, bugs while driving motorcycles, all of that. That will certainly come up in our Feedback Friday episode. So if you have not heard the episode from Monday, it is incredibly tragic and depressing. So what are you waiting for? Yeah. Today, though, I thought I would keep it lighter and talk about companion planting. This was a topic that came up at the event on Saturday in Evansville, Indiana, which who knew I would get so much fodder from this event, but from a single day event, but clearly it was a good one. There, someone asked me during my talk about companion planting and if I do a lot of it. And the answer is not really, though I still do a fair amount of interplanting. Those two ideas are not necessarily the same thing, and I did a detailed video about that idea, about the differences that I will link in the show notes. Interplanting, for its part, is trying to get two crops from the same space without one negatively affecting the other, but companion planting is this idea that you plant two things together that are either mutually beneficial or one directly benefits the other by warding off a pest, disease, etc. Think planting marigolds and tomatoes together. The marigolds to repel whiteflies, nematodes, and other pests, which there is actually some science there where researchers have found that interplanting specific marigold varieties, all varieties do not have an equal effect on tomatoes, but you plant them into tomatoes to help repel whitefly populations so long as these pests were not already established. Ditto root knot nematodes, and one study found that marigolds and white mustard interplanted helped to deter those as well. No matter what the crop is, the idea here is that you're growing one crop without a direct or immediate economic benefit to help another crop grow. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about companion planting. And there are quite a few little studies like those out there. So why don't more professional growers, including myself, do much companion planting like that? Well, there are several potential reasons and possibly more that the comment section can chime in on. But the first is just practical. Growing space ain't cheap. Sacrificing growing space to crops from which you cannot derive a profit, unless, of course, you're selling those marigolds, but the value of the whiteflies is in the chemical that the flower releases, so in that case, you wouldn't want to harvest them. Anyway, yeah, sacrificing valuable growing space is tough. Another reason is that if you focus your energy on the health of the soil, you will simply have fewer pests and will need fewer interventions like those. Now, I am all about preventative measures and flowers and biodiversity, even when your soil is rocking. You never know when an imbalance is going to pop up and some issue is going to erupt from seemingly out of nowhere. So part of the reason you don't see more commercial growers using companion planting is that they don't need it as much, or they would rather focus on soil health. Or for others, especially the more conventional growers, even if they're organic, will just spray something. More ecologically minded growers may also simply find other spaces, not within the same growing space, to plant beneficial flowers like in hedgerows. We always have marigolds around because marigolds are beneficial, but also marigolds are fun. For as intense as they smell, I always enjoy it. Then, of course, in terms of valuable space, even if a grower wants to absolutely maximize their growing space, they are more than likely going to plant a cash crop there. Like, I don't generally plant things like marigolds within my tomato beds, but I will plant things like beets and lettuce because it's a practical decision. I can get an entire crop out of the bed while the tomatoes mature. That's interplanting. Otherwise, that space below the tomatoes is wasted. Or another example is like how I often use the tunnel space is I sow my early carrots, usually mokum or some other sub 60 days to maturity carrot, in January, leaving a space in the middle to transplant my tomatoes in April. Then I pull my carrots around that same time and the tomatoes take over the bed. Those two crops get along perfectly fine, and maybe the tomatoes benefit from the carrots in some way, but that benefit is not the goal. The goal is to use the space well. All that said, I love having flowers like Sweet Alyssum below and around my tomatoes, and I think there is space to have non-productive smaller flowers like that around tomato beds or in the pathways without taking space away. Most marigolds, however, are simply a big lumbering plant that can compete with tomatoes. And of course, there are non-commercial growers who use this combo because it can work, but also because it looks cool. I mean, it does. The more flowers, the merrier, in my opinion. So if you can find a way to put them in there, that's great. Anyway, thoughts on companion plantings in commercial gardens? Let me know. Otherwise, up next, let's get a question from our Patreon members on accents. BRB. Today's episode of Growers Daily is brought to you by Johnny's Selected Seeds. When you need proven varieties you can count on and detailed guidance from seeding to harvest, consider Johnny's your trusted growing partner. Their same-day shipping can help keep your planting schedules on track when the unexpected happens. They're here to help you grow good food. Turning to Johnny's means you can plant high-quality, trial-proven varieties with confidence and know that their expert staff is ready to help with first-hand knowledge, because they've grown them themselves. Learn more at johnnyseeds.com. All right, back to the show. If you, the listener, are enjoying this podcast and want to ensure it sticks around for a while, you can do so over at patreon.com/no-till-growers. I will try to get to questions from everywhere. Questions come in, but I will always get to those Patreon questions. And Patreon members, you've been awesome in loading me up on questions. Today's question comes from one of our beloved Patreon members named Susan, which you know we love our Susans around here, who writes, quote, "Speaking of Kentucky, you don't appear to have a Kentucky accent, just really good at doing impressions of non-Kentuckians or other," end quote. So this was probably in reference to the episode I did talking up the state of Kentucky and many of its great features. And no, I guess I don't really have an accent. For those of you not from the United States, Kentuckians are known for their southern drawl. This is often what gets Kentucky grouped in with the southern states, where a southern drawl is common because location-wise we're considered more Midwestern, not necessarily Southern, but we do have a good Southern accent. Of course, every area has its own accent, but it's often not as pronounced as the Kentucky or the Southern accent. The research seems to suggest that most accents start developing as young as 6 months old, which if you've ever seen a French baby babble, it is both cute and highly accented. But the accent is generally solidified by the time a child is 12 years old. So perhaps part of the reason I don't have a strong drawl is because I was raised in Colorado for the first decade of my life, and then I moved all over the country a bunch of times before settling in Kentucky. So during the time in which someone would develop a strong accent, I was not in a consistent situation, or at least not consistently exposed to a strong accent. Part of it is also that neither of my parents are from Kentucky, nor did they have strong accents. When I first got to Kentucky, I was told I had a bit of a Western accent, and now when I hear people from Colorado and thereabouts, I can hear theirs, but did not grow up thinking there was such a thing as a Colorado accent. Western accents are a bit more subtle than Southern ones, but they certainly exist. I also noticed that my Southern accent comes out when I talk to people who do have a Kentucky accent. It happened to me yesterday, in fact, when I was buying some grass seed for our soccer fields from a local feed and tractor supply store. The guys there are native Kentuckians, and I can hear my voice shift subtly when I talk to them. I don't at all do it consciously, but it definitely happens where I get a little bit of a Kentucky accent when I talk to native Kentuckians. I've also heard older audio recordings of me where I have different vocal quirks that I no longer have. One odd thing about accents is that we don't always hear how accents change over time because it's so slow and subtle, not just as our voices change, but as culture changes and as popular accents change. Terry Gross, whom I love, one of the greatest interviewers of all time, who hosts Fresh Air, is one of the clearest examples of that because you can literally hear the evolution of her accent over the decades when they replay an old show or old interview that she did. If you go back and listen to those old broadcasts of that show or any long-running show really, you hear the complete difference quite dramatically. There's quite a bit of interesting research about accents and changing one's accent to either move away from an accent that is perceived as less intelligent or lower in socioeconomic status, or to move towards an accent that is perceived as higher class or smarter. To be sure, accents do not inherently represent intelligence. According to the research, people also do change their accent to simply facilitate communication, like me at buying seed at a local shop, adopting the local accent or softening their own. Anytime I hear my own accent come out, it still feels a little artificial, but perhaps that's because it is to some extent. I have lived here for the better part of 25 years, but I am not from Kentucky, and I did not live here in that developmental stage. More often than not, however, I am unconsciously unleashing the artificial Kentucky accent I picked up when I'm around my more accented friends. Part of that is me trying to fit in. I'm sure I moved a lot as a kid, so trying to fit in is sort of my default setting in my brain, but I'm also very fond of that Kentucky accent. And almost certainly there are words I say that carry a little more of an accent, but my accent is still pretty neutral or maybe even fairly Western. And of course, imitation is the highest form of flattery, right? However, I think that, perhaps, unconsciously using the Kentucky accent makes me feel more comfortable around native Kentuckians. And who knows, maybe it makes them feel more comfortable around me, around somebody who doesn't have an accent. I suppose that psychologically, that's why we do that with our voices, right? And as a side note, our youngest child has picked up a bit of a Kentucky accent himself, and I love it. I hope he keeps it, because it isn't uncommon for people to move away from strong accents as they get older, consciously or unconsciously. But it is a bit unfortunate because accents are awesome, and we should be proud of them. So anyway, great question, Susan. Also, thanks for this question, because I probably would have never explored the literature on accents if you hadn't brought it up. So that's fun. Anyway, we're going to take one break, and then up next, let's discuss farmers markets. Be right back. Today's episode of Growers Daily is brought to you by Farmhand. I don't know about you, but I got into farming to be in the field growing food for my community, not creating elaborate pack lists, not writing newsletters or responding to emails, not designing and maintaining web stores, and etc. And I especially don't enjoy doing those things after an already full and fulfilling day of growing food. Actually, if I spent less time on my phone and behind the computer, that would be great. If only there were a solution for that. Enter Farmhand. Farmhand is the only all-in-one virtual assistant built by and for farmers. With one single platform, Farmhand enables you to offload your administrative tasks, send and manage communications, and sell more to your customers. Farmhand saves growers an average of 6 hours of administrative load each week. That's 6 hours so you can get back into the field, spend more time with friends or family, or have a life outside of the farm, which is actually a thing. Think about it. What would you do with an extra 6 hours a week? Sign up for a free trial with the link in the show notes, because now is the best time to dial in those systems for the next growing season. Follow the Farmhand link in the show notes to learn more. All right, back to the show. Okay, so one thing I want to start talking about on this show is different marketing options and whether or not I think one is a good idea or not based on a given situation. So let's start with one of the most popular ways to break into marketing your produce or products, the farmer's market. Does it make sense to sell at a farmer's market or at a farmer's market to what you're already doing, like a CSA or wholesale or whatever? This was something that came up a lot during the panel I helped with on Saturday, and something I've thought about a lot since then. First, here are some positive attributes of selling at farmers markets. One, and arguably my favorite attribute, is that it is low stress. There is very little commitment on your end. If you don't have enough produce that week, for instance, which can certainly happen when you are just starting out, you can just bring whatever you have or save it for the next week and skip the market. Sure, some customers will be bummed that you're not there, perhaps, but unlike a CSA where the customers have paid already for that week, no one is expecting anything at farmers market per se, so there is no way to let them down. Of course, one obligatory note here that you should always try to be consistent in coming to the farmers market, but still, you don't have to, which takes a lot of the pressure off. Two, farmers markets can be quite profitable in the right situation. The right situation would be one where there are a lot of customers and a reasonable amount of vendors, most of whom do not sell what you sell, and you can move a lot of product. Three, farmers markets can pay a nice complement to other outlets and open up options for new outlets. For instance, when we were running a CSA, a weekly vegetable subscription, which I will discuss more in time, but sometimes we would offer crops like squash for a couple weeks to our CSA, stop offering squash for 2 weeks, and then do a third week later on so as not to bombard people with this prolific crop. Having the farmer's market meant that we could move the squash during the weeks we were not giving it to our CSA, which was awesome. Okay, so number 4, you can charge more at farmers markets because it's basically a mobile retail shop. It's basically like having a brick and mortar shop for your farm products, but without the brick or the mortar. Number 5, Markets provide fun social interactions in an industry that can often feel quite isolating. Hard to overstate how lonely this job of farming can be, especially if you don't take on business partners. Now, there are more benefits, and without question, farmers markets can be profitable. But if I'm weighing my options, here are some negatives that I would consider. One, farmers markets can be hard to get into, especially if you just grow what everyone else grows. I've talked about the value of being certified organic in the eyes of customers, but it's also helpful in the eyes of farmers market boards. Mom and pop farms with no certification are, and I say this with absolute affection, a dime a dozen. Certified organic farms are not super common in many regions, so perhaps that certification not only gets you an instant customer base at the market, but gets you into the market to begin with because they are lacking organic vendors. That was the case for us. We easily got into a really big market because we were certified organic. Okay, negative number two, farmers markets are very time and labor intensive. On the harvest side, everything has to be individualized or unitized, meaning unlike a wholesale account where you maybe bag 5 or 10 pounds of lettuce at a time, for the farmers market, you are bagging quarter or half pound bags at a time, which can quadruple the washing and packing work. That time has to be factored into calculating whether a market is actually profitable for you or not. Also, in terms of labor and time, there is the time of travel to and from the market, the early morning setup, the time spent selling, the breakdown, the unpacking, and so on. So a day at the farmer's market, depending on how far you have to drive, can equate to 8 hours or more of just selling. Comparing that to a few hours dropping off food to restaurants, and it's a big difference. That time, especially when you have kids and all those things, will be important to you. Number three, rain, wind, snow, cold, heat. I'm sure you've heard of all of these. If your market is outdoors, you are likely to suffer at least a couple weeks every season that are just the absolute pits in terms of experience and of sales. Obviously, most retail or service industries take weather hits, but when your retail shop is outdoors, the effects can be quite acute. There are more negative and more positives to farmers markets, of course, because there is no one perfect, easy way to sell something, which we will go over more in time. So make sure you are subscribed to this channel or following or whatever, wherever you are hearing or watching this. Also, one large ask from me, please make sure to share this show with your friends whenever you enjoy one of them. That is wildly helpful to us. A Facebook group, an Instagram story, a yard sign, a postcard, a tattoo, I'll leave it to you. Otherwise, that's it for Wednesday. Huge shout out to Willie Breeding for the theme music and the team at No Till Growers. Biggest thank you ever to our Patreon members at patreon.com/no-till-growers, where at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, or if you just sign up in the month of November, you get a shout out in the show. So big shout outs today to Jennifer. Jennifer gets her own story because Jennifer is actually, in this novel, is actually a town in southern Illinois. It's called Jennifer, Illinois. And there is a biologist there named Jennifer, no relation to the town. And she moves there to study a plant that they find in the woods that makes you have a certain affectation to your voice when you start talking. And they believe that this plant is actually the origin of the Southern drawl. And so it follows that story. And then aliens attack. And I think Jennifer survives. It's fine. But aliens all the time, aliens. Anyway, thanks for listening and or watching. We'll see you tomorrow.